my colleague Sasha Bošković is with us also today. And we are pleased to have with us our fall 2021 István Deák visiting professor, David de Paço, who is going to present today on some of his research. And so I'll just briefly introduce David, and then we'll give him an opportunity to talk about some of his work, and then we'll open it up for questions to the audience, both here in our seminar room as well as online. David, as I said, is the István Deák visiting professor this semester, and he's a historian of the Habsburg Empire in the 18th century. His research lies at the intersection of urban history, diaspora studies, and historical anthropology. He completed his dissertation in 2012 at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. And since then, he has been a Max Weber Fellow in Florence at EUI, and also at the Central European University and IAS Core Fellow. He published his first monograph in 2015, The Orient and Vienna in the 18th Century in French. And that same year, he joined Sciences.
Sciences Po.
Okay.
That's the abbreviation.
That's the abbreviation, okay. Where, among other responsibilities, he directed the departmental seminar in European history. At Columbia, he's working on a new project called Islam, which stands for European Societies in the Light of Apolitical Muslims. He's recently contributed to the Historical Journal, Urban History, and the International History Review. And his talk today is called Muslims in the 18th Century Habsburg Cities, the Social Integration of an Unincorporated Population. Let's welcome David.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Thank you, Sasha, for the invitation to share with you a part of this new project. What I'm going to do is just to share some ideas and maybe to try to have a conversation together about the possible perspective. So thank you for all of you to be there in the seminar room, and all of those who connected enjoy the seminar online. So I just wanted to start this presentation by this quotation extract from a private correspondence, and I think this is very important. A private correspondence between the Habsburg representative in Istanbul, Peter Herbert von Radkiel, with the Vice Chancellor of State in Vienna. So this is a letter sent in 1796, and here is what the ambassador, the Habsburg ambassador in Istanbul, wrote. I have not talking to you for a long time about my old obsession of setting up a little Mahometan colony at home. The correspondence was in French, so at home is a traduction for chez nous. It is an object roughly of your interest, and which could become very useful to us in time. We cannot leave it to the chance because religious prejudice still prevents it being realized. We must, on the contrary, try to get them on our side and take advantage of it. I imagine two possibilities to get there. First, the tomb of the Mahometan saint Gabeya on the bank of the Sava River, which should be decorated a little in the Turkish manner, and a smaller piece should be added for the pilgrims. Some devout families will go to fix their residence in the vicinity, and they will form a population as in our ancient sanctuaries. Second, in Buda, there is still a mosque that was revered by the Turks. It is said that recently a dervish went there in pilgrimage. Maybe he's still there. If the mosque were repaired, if it were provided with an imam who I could find for you, if a Turkish-style Pious foundation, the Waqf, were added to it, if the families who settled there were accorded fiscal exemption, maybe this is the most important part, I am sure that with time the prejudices would have abated, and in our old age we should be delighted to see Mahometan colonies in Hungary. I'm not sure Victor Orban connected to this, which would already exist if our predecessor, meaning Maria Theresa, had thought like us. This is not here the eccentric project of an enlightened man. This project fitting in with a very long correspondence started in 1779, discussing about the opportunity to transfer 20 Muslim villages from Bosnia into Hungary. these families, the families who compose the Muslim Bosnian villages, were actually the descendants of Muslims from Hungary who have been expelled from Hungary by the Habsburg in the late 17th century. And the discussion was actually very serious. The Habsburg administration, meaning the central administration in Vienna, at the end of the day, of course, reject the proposal of the ambassador, not because they didn't want a Muslim on their soil, but just because they care about the good diplomatic relationship with Istanbul. And this was not the only attempt, or even the first attempt in the 18th century to create a Muslim community in the Habsburg lands. Already in the early 18th century, an Ottoman merchant named Ömer Aga, he operated in Vienna. And he took the opportunity of the trade agreement of Passarowitz in 1718 to apply to the position of Shah Bendar, meaning general consul of the Ottoman merchant in the city of Vienna. He gets the support of the Divan in Istanbul in 1725. In 1726, he arrived in Vienna properly as a representative of the Ottoman community in the Habsburg monarchy. When I say Ottoman community, I mean the Muslims, of course, but also the Dhimmi, the people who were protected by the Sultan and originally from the Ottoman Empire. His attempt to organize this Ottoman community was actually a failure. It was a failure not because the Habsburg administration didn't want it to happen. On the contrary, they were even open to the idea that the Muslim could have a mosque in Vienna on the principle of the reciprocity, since the Catholic subject of the emperor had a church in Istanbul. No, it was a failure because the Ottoman nation protested against the consul, and they said, we don't understand why we have to pay a tax for this guy, since we have already the protection of the Habsburg administration, and we don't need any intermediary. And all over the 18th century, the Muslim population in Vienna remained an unincorporated population in a community-based society. An unincorporated population, I mean a population who had no civic right, who was not granted with the right to organize itself as a proper religious or ethno-religious communities, contrary to the Greeks, for example, or to the Sephard Jews, for example, at the same time in the same place. And since they were an unincorporated population, they have to diversify their social belongings in order to compensate for this lack of political leverage. But because they were an unincorporated population, historians actually have forgotten them. It's very easy when we want to work on official and legal minorities because the archive of an administration are made actually designed the history of this community. For example, if we want to start a history of the Ottoman Greek in Vienna, we just have to collect the boxes entitled Greeks and just to open the boxes and see what is in it. It's very different for studying the history of the Muslims. There is at least two reasons that explain that the Muslims have been excluded from this history of the Habsburg monarchy, the history of the Holy Roman Empire, and more broadly, the history of Europe. The first reason is, I think, ideological. They have been erased from the European history by the narrative of the nation state. I mean, this is an obvious reason. Everybody already knows that, but it still has an impact on the historiography. For example, the way historians refer to the Ottoman period in Central Europe is usually the Ottoman occupation. Like the Ottoman Empire has no legitimacy to be there. And this vocabulary, this expression at some point put at the same level the Ottoman Empire and the Nazi Germany. And it tells a lot on the way, it tells a lot about the damnatio memoriae of the Ottoman history in Hungary, in Greece, and also the historiography is a bit more nuanced in Serbia and in Bulgaria too. And there is also methodological reasons. As I said, there is no collection about the Muslims. Also, there is collection about the Ottoman Greeks, the Sephard Jews, or the Armenians. But that doesn't mean that there is no document. And sometimes the name of an Ottoman trader in Vienna appear in the same collection, if not on the same document, if not on the same page than those of the Ottoman Greek. Historian has just not paid adequate attention to them. And the way the archive of the Habsburg administration are organized tells actually a lot about these histories. Muslims were dispersed names within the Habsburg archive. So if we want to study them, we need to develop a very empirical approach. But I think these dispersions, and I'm not referring to a diaspora, but really the dispersion of the name in the different boxes, also reflects the strategies of the Muslim to develop different forms of protection and to compensate, again, for the lack of institutional leverage. So the Muslim did not constitute a legal community. Maybe they did not even constitute a relational community, but they were a population. And I use here the model developed by Olivier Roy, the French sociologist of Islam in Western Europe. I mean, his very contemporary work. As a population, the Muslim represents a diverse community, economically, socially, culturally, gender diverse community from several generations. Some of them were immigrants, others were born and raised in the Habsburg monarchy. They also operate in different, let's say, category of city of the Habsburg Empire, and this is very important. The PowerPoint is there. So the first category of city are the mainland city, the city mostly of the Holy Roman Empire. I added here Bratislava, which at that time was the capital of the Kingdom of Hungary, Pressburg, and those cities has been evangelized in the late antiquity, and they were controlled by the corporate bodies, the corporations, the trades. So being an incorporated population in this city, meaning not being able to incorporate, to be part of this corporate body who ruled the political life of the city. The second category of city were the port cities. Trieste, Fiume meaning Rijeka, but also Messina and Ostend, because those cities of the Habsburg Empire are also totally relevant in this history, were free ports, and the free ports were organized by the trading diaspora, established on ethno-religious basis. And again, here, being an incorporated population meant being a foreigner, not numerous enough, not influential enough, not wealthy enough to organize a proper community and to be associated with the government of the city. And the third category, which is for me the most interesting, are the category composed by the cities of the Danube River Basin, which were formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, of the Ottoman rules. So I mentioned here Pest, Timișoara, and Belgrade for a short period of time, maybe 2 decades. A part of the historiography describes this moment in between the late 17th and the early 20th century as a period of ethnic cleansing of Hungary, an ethnic cleansing against the Muslims. And this ethnic cleansing was implemented through proper massacre of Muslim population. We have evidence of that. Deportation of Muslim population, their exfiltration, they usually resettled in Bosnia, or at some point engaged in the Ottoman army and were sent at the Safavid borders, or forced conversion of this population. What is actually very interesting in this very specific case is that the situation of Hungary in the early 18th century corresponds or had many elements to share with the situation of Spain in the late 15th and early 16th century. Meaning that we can legitimately ask or look for certain form of crypto-Islam, crypto-practice of Islam in a society where they were only Christians. And what is certain, what is proof now, is the different connections that the people who settled in Bosnia continue to develop with their city of origin in Hungary. So we have architectural and iconographic evidence of that. This is a perspective, a point of view from the Habsburg army in 1684 when they besieged the cities of Buda and Pest. And maybe we could be surprised about the architecture of these cities. But this is not an Orientalist work. This is, I mean, really the engravings of a military that describe the battle and had very strategical and propaganda purposes. But this still exists in the architecture in Hungary, in the city of Pécs, where you had the former mosque turned into a cathedral, the former minaret turned into Christian column, and of course the statue of the Emperor in the foreground, in Eger as well. And even today in the city of Eger, you have this minaret, but with a cross on the top. So that symbolizes the Recatholicization. And which is for me even more interesting is this mausoleum in Ilok in Croatia today, because the mausoleum is really the place where the people were buried. Why a city that has been entirely recatholized would have kept this kind of monuments irrelevant regarding to the religion, just because the family from the city at the Ottoman time, they just divided themselves between Christian and Muslim. And this is a part of the history of the city and a part of the memory of the family who ruled the city that is there. And they, at some point, also totally endorsed this Muslim heritage. The question of the graveyards that you can see here in front of Pest or there, just on the north, meaning on the right of the city of Buda, is also very interesting. They have been totally recovered by all over the 18th century by the urban development. So how the memory of the people, of the Muslim people work. We know from the first quotation that actually some people returned in Hungary in as a pilgrims, maybe to pay their respect to their family or to the former holy seats. I mean, all these questions are really open. I can elaborate during the discussion if you want. Anyway, well, the mausoleum of Gulbaba also something very interesting because it has been restored by Recep Tayyip Erdogan 3 years ago and inaugurated by Viktor Orban. At the same time, Viktor Orban said in Brussels that he didn't want the Muslim community in the Hungarian soil because he didn't like the consequence of having too many Muslims in Hungary. Anyway, this is politics and different level and different context of enunciation. Okay, there is many evidence and many archives that actually document the social life of the Muslim in the Habsburg monarchy in the 18th century. I will present 5 of them. So first, the Central Archive of the Habsburg administration, and especially the archive produced by the Board of Trade. The Habsburg administration used the category of Türkischen Untertanen, meaning Turkish subject, to refer to the Ottomans. In Turkish subject, we of course have the Muslims, but also the non-Muslims, the dhimmi, who were subject of the Sultan. Among the documents we can find are many petitions sent by the Ottoman to the Habsburg administration in order to ask for more privileges, to extend their legal capacity to trade. For example, we also have petitions sent by the corporate bodies of the local municipality, for example, in order to complain against the Ottoman, saying that these Ottoman were too free and undermine their own privileges, own commercial privileges. One can find many reports and assessments about the Ottoman trade. The Habsburg administration really tried to develop this Ottoman trade because it taxed the trade, so it was important for the treasuries. And also some census of population, like this one, produced in 1767 in Vienna. So this is a collection of statements made by Ottoman merchants. And you can find here all the different data that contain each of the statements of the merchants. So the first category deals with the identity, the name, the age, the place of birth, the religion, the temporary address in Vienna, the permanent address, usually in the Ottoman Empire, the family numbers, the administrative data, meaning the first entry on the territory, the last entry on the territory, the border post they cross, and we learn a lot about what is today one of the suburbs of Belgrade, Zemun, the city of Semlin at that time. The proof of citizenship, they have to really distinguish the Ottoman from the Habsburg sujet. It was not obvious, for example, for the Jews, because the Ottoman Jews had more privilege than the German Jews in Vienna. So we have the example of some German Jews who went to Belgrade, paid the tax to the Sultan, and returned to the Habsburg monarchy, saying, you see, now I am an Ottoman subject, so I am free to trade. Proof of quarantine, this is something we can develop as well. The quarantine was systematic when someone entered the Habsburg monarchy from the Ottoman Empire, the passport. The economic activities, the place they visited, the address of the warehouse or warehouses in Vienna, the partners, the location of the partners, the commodities, the trade, the value of their commodities. I transcribed from, well, it's a bit from the German to French and French to English, but anyway, this is a statement of one of the Muslim merchants in Vienna, Imam Emir Ahmed Effendi, and you can imagine all what we can do with so many letters. So we know a lot about their background. We know that there is the major part of the Muslims in Vienna, 40% came from the city of Alanya in south of Anatolia, and very surprisingly not from the Balkan. We know how they progressively enter the Habsburg monarchy. They establish their trade from Alanya to Istanbul to Trieste or to Belgrade, and from Belgrade to Vienna. But they didn't stop in Vienna. Vienna was just a station from which they could access to the Holy Roman Empire, especially the wealthy market in Nuremberg, in Leipzig, in Habsburg, Dresden as well. We have evidence of the trade of this merchant also in Breslau, Wrocław, in Poland today, and in Bratislava as well. Again, I can elaborate later about the sociology of the Muslim merchant. Then the municipal archive. So the municipal archive usually emphasizes the litigation between the Ottoman and the corporate body and the local corporate body. One of the cases, the most interesting case for me, is a series of documents about a conflict between the city of Graz and the Ottoman merchants trading between Trieste and Vienna. So Graz was between those two cities. And the city of Graz said, we are an autonomous political unit, so we are entitled to tax the Ottoman merchant. The Ottoman merchant said, unswerved, no, we are here because of an international agreement between Vienna and Istanbul, and so in the Habsburg monarchy, we are under the protection of the emperor. What did the emperor unswerve? The emperor definitely defended and supported the claim of the Ottoman merchant, because it was for the Habsburg administration a way to undermine the authority of the corporate body. It's the very classical history of the absolutism. We can find many investigations and reports, of course, also the petition that I have already mentioned. But the municipal archive, and I am an urban historian, and this is very difficult for me to admit it, have very important limits. So for example, it's very difficult when we want to focus on pest to get some information about the Muslim merchant. And even when we talk with the local historians and the curators, they always are like, I mean, there were no Muslims in 18th century Hungary. But this is what we can find in the Habsburg archive, in the archive of the Central Administration. So in the conscription in 1767, we have just 4 different examples of Muslim merchants who say that actually he traveled and traded in Timișoara, Petrovaradz, in Pest in Hungary before becoming in Vienna. The other one that he sold a part of his merchandise, of its commodity, in the city of Pest. The other one as well, he sold his horses in Pest. The other one is even settled in the city of Pest. So there is definitely this question of the invisibility of the incorporated people, the people who didn't take any archive. But from the Habsburg perspective, just because the Habsburg administration was interested in supporting them in order to just strengthen the centralization of the monarchy, we have some evidence, and this is just the beginning of the research. I mean, the one in Hungary, And I think that test can deliver us an amazing perspective and something that we totally ignore about the history of Hungary. Other interesting archive are the consular and the diplomatic archive. I can mention some Ottoman report, what we call the Seferatname, meaning the report that the Ottoman ambassador wrote when they returned to the Ottoman Empire, and they described their life in the Habsburg monarchy. Police reports are also very interesting, but the most important for me are the journals, the diary written by the interpreter of Oriental languages who followed the Ottoman diplomats all over their journey in the Habsburg Empire. And they basically describe and mention all the people that the most important Ottoman dignitary met in the Habsburg monarchy. So they describe a real system of patronage that the Ottomans developed in the Habsburg monarchy. And we understand how the Ottoman, at least the diplomat, were totally integrated to the Habsburg political life. They were definitely not outsiders. They belonged to the same form of clientelism, the same household at some point, how they were involved in the economic life, especially of Vienna, and how, of course, they protected their own subject. Okay, the fourth type of documents I'm using in this research is composed of iconographic and statistical material. The 18th century is a period where the European city expands a lot. Vienna multiplied by 10 its population in 100 years, and the population extends and it's changed a lot. New social category appeared, and the population culturally and religiously diversified all over the empire. And so the statistician, the topographer, try to understand this process and try to build, forge, and offer new category in order to understand the transformation of the society, and of course for the government to govern this new society. Of course, they overstate the diversity of Vienna, of Trieste, like it is mentioned here. We could have the same kind of comparison with the city of Timișoara, which at some point its development really looked like the one of Trieste. But still, they tell us something that we cannot find in the historiography. Meaning that when we look the classical work on 18th century Vienna, or even on Trieste, it is impossible to find these people with a turban. They are totally absent of the historiography. 18th century, 19th century Trieste is all about the Greek diaspora, how they've been successful and how they have connected the city to the Mediterranean. From the perspective of the artists of the time, this city is full of Muslims, or was full of Muslims. Maybe this is again overstated, because showing the diversity of the city is a way to celebrate the good policy. But still, it's an invitation to actually maybe try to find more documents about these people. And as a matter of fact, I mean, I have plenty of pictures like this. As a matter of fact, the iconographic materials totally match with the administrative materials. In Vienna, the places that are represented by the different artists correspond to the neighborhood described by the administration. And the people who are represented by the artists are the people that at least that the Habsburg administration knows. Okay, the last part of the project is about the architecture of the city. And I'm using here the methodology developed by Nancy Hume on the coffee trader of Mocha in Yemen in the 18th century. And how Nancy Hume tried to understand the everyday interaction between the different community of Mocha from the perspective of the architecture, because she had no concrete literary sources to do so. And this is, for me, a real model, a real masterpiece. And we can try to understand, just to project on the map, like here, the different place where the Ottoman merchants settled in the city. We can be even a bit more accurate. And just from the architecture, what we understand is that these unincorporated people didn't live together. They spread in the city. They spread in the city, but they were also, I mean, their geography was organized and was very well structured by notably their patron and protector, whether they were from the aristocracy, like the number 9 or the number 8. Those people were noblemen in Vienna, involved in the Ottoman trade, and at the same time, they had official position in the Habsburg administration. Pure clientelism, very classic system of patronage. And we progressively understand that actually they don't meet in the streets, they don't meet on the public sphere, but most of their life was structured by the different accommodation building entangled in this series of passage, courtyard, inns, coffee houses, semi-private public buildings. So I try to understand a bit more these two specific places, so the Deutschenhodenhof and the Heiligenkreuzerhof. So concretely, they belong to a monastery. The monasteries were out of Vienna, and the monastery received a privilege for the emperor in order to have this building in the city and to make money and to have new incomes in renting the workhouses and the flat in the Hof, in the courtyards. The first one is very interesting because actually we have a description of it by Mozart, who stayed a couple of months there, and this is exactly the period when he wrote the Sonata La Turca. And we have also mention of the Deutschenhodenhof among the Ottoman population who settled there, who had their flat, their warehouses. And the Deutschenhodenhof was totally integrated in this inner system. What I want to say is that at the end of the day, I don't really care about doing a history of the Muslims. I use the Muslims as an unincorporated population. And from their perspective, I think we can strongly reinterpret the early modern history, and especially the early modern history of the city of the Habsburg monarchy. So just briefly, a couple of conclusions or topic for discussion. First, I think we should concretely consider the decorrelation between the legal status of the people, of the foreigner, and their ability to be socially integrated. It's not because the passport does not determine your social life. Second, sorry, we should also pay more attention to the life of the people who were beside the corporate bodies or the legal communities. They are certainly not the ones who are the most accessible in the archive. But if we want to change the perspective of the early modern history and to understand something that is not necessarily related to the history of the elite, because I really think the trading nation only concerned the elite, the people who are no money, were protected by the nation, but were not part of the nation, of the trading nation. We should really take them more and more into consideration. We should also stress the fundamental role played by the city as almost in terms of material culture in the everyday life interaction of these people. The role of the traditional structure of the old regime in the globalization of the Habsburg monarchy. If the Muslim merchants were integrated in Vienna, in Trieste, in Pest, in Timișoara, this is because they received the support of the nobility, and the nobility used them to expand their influence in the Ottoman Empire. And so to really continue to explore the social life of what Natalie Rothman named the trans-imperial subject, and here the trans-imperial circulation and clientele. We should also pay more attention to the role of the unincorporated population in the statecraft. As I tried to demonstrate with the city of Graz, they were an excuse, they were a leverage for the central power in order to reinforce its position against the municipality, against the church. That's the first quotation I share with you. And all the corporate body of the Ancien Régime. And maybe I just will stop there. This is a lot of topic to share with you. And I thank you very much for your attention and your participation. Thank you very much.
Maybe should just join you.
Yeah, you should.
Thank you so much, David. This was very, very rich and very layered. Thank you all for coming, and I want just to reiterate that those of you who are following us on Zoom, via Zoom, you can ask questions via Q&A function, and people who are here, of course, you can raise your hand and ask question, so we can all hear you. Yeah, maybe I can just start off and ask David to, could you say a little bit more about, are there beside Muslims in the cities that you looked at them closely in this period, are there other groups, social groups or ethnic groups that could also count as unincorporated? And if there is, what do they share with Muslims in particular?
Mm-hmm. A way to answer your question is to say that my methodology on the Muslim is empire by the gender studies, and how actually the history of women in the city has really changed over the 10 last year, the work of Daniel van Enhoven, for example, and how they bring to the light that, I mean, they totally challenge the idea that the women, the social life of the women were correlated to the domesticity, while the public space were for the men. So this is this methodology I'm taking into consideration. So this is more broadly an history of the subaltern, or the people who are not supposed to be where they were, according to the standards, the dominations. Otherwise, yes, being an incorporated person doesn't mean that you are poor. I think this is very important. It means that you, at some point, you are in a sort of state or social state of foreignness, meaning you don't necessarily have access to all the leverage to the political representation. There is some work by Simona Ceruti, I mean, not some work, but a very fundamental work on the history of Torino in the 18th century, of the foreigner in Torino in the 18th century, which is more than inspiring. I mean, it's totally a new perspective that she opened. And she perfectly demonstrates that someone can be very wealthy, but have very poor leverage, legally speaking, in order to act in the society. So, meaning there is many people like this. If you are not a man, if you are not a citizen, and if you don't own any property, all the rest can properly be considered as unincorporated people. Of course, they had different social capitals, they had different strategies. So this is an entire world to reinterpret. But the history of the migrants who are arriving in Trieste, whether they were Muslim or not, and just were looking for a job, you know, and daily by daily had to look for a job and to get the money to live, are part of this incorporated population. One of the Trieste topographers mentioned them as masterless. So they can, we can understand the positive connotation of the people who were free, but they were also people in a very precarious situation. And this precarity, I think, could be maybe the best definition of the unincorporated population.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, I would open floor if anyone has a question. Feel free to jump in and ask. But maybe not for now. Okay. Also, if you can say us more. So, as I understand, for example, from contemporary perspective, that official history would differentiate from what personal memory or what Pierre Nora like looks at into. Is there any similar documents in the 18th century that you accounted for in looking at this type of population that were not recognized in the official documents?
So recently, Giancarlo Casale has published an English traduction of the memoir of a former Ottoman captive in Vienna in the late 17th century. The memoir had been written in the early 18th century. This is absolutely wonderful. When we take the perspective of Osman from Timișoara, the main character of the author of the memoir, we definitely have the feeling that Vienna has even a Muslim relational community, which I don't believe for the 18th century. I have no evidence of that. But in the late 18th century, Osman of Timișoara was able to develop his protection over all the captives who were in the city of Vienna. And since he had an important position in the Ottoman Empire, he was a kind of interlocutor between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg nobility. But he became also an agent and a client from the Habsburg nobility, being able to directly talk to the prime minister, the chancellor of state of the moment, and to develop very interesting social strategy with him. We also have an insight in the everyday life interaction in the city of Vienna in the late 17th century from Osman from Timișoara, where, I mean, we know everything about, not everything, but what he wanted to share about his love story, him being drunk and fighting in the street and whatever you can imagine of that time. So yes, there is actually a document that should be more considered. But I think the question of the memory is very interesting. It's mostly a matter of scales. And Budapest is very interesting for that. I mean, even today, we have this official narrative from the Hungarian government saying, no, we don't want to have a Muslim community on their soil. And we have the proper memory of the city of Buda, who say the mausoleum of Gulbaba is very important for us because it's part of our identity. Not necessarily because Gulbaba was a Muslim dervish, just because the mausoleum is part of the city identity. And when we talk about memory, I think we should permanently shift between the different scale, and the memory of the local population is sometimes more interesting for the historian than the memory of the state or of the nation.
Yeah, it seems so, especially for this period and this kind of social relations that differ so much from what we have today, let's say, or throughout the 20th century. I think we have a question from the audience. Could you just please introduce yourself before asking a question?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for the talk, David. My name is Sonia Buka. I'm a visiting scholar here from Berlin. I wanted to ask because I think the idea of an unincorporated people is really interesting, and especially the way that you framed it in your previous answer as the majority of the population at various moments in history. And the way you introduced it at the beginning of your talk was to say that the unincorporated people are those who lack civic rights. The normal discourse around civic rights is that it's something that's fought over and won, it's something that's gained. It's a battle, whether it's it's women's suffrage or civil rights. Is there any benefits to being an unincorporated people? And when the status changes, is that always a positive thing?
Yeah, definitely. This is a very provocative question, and I like it. And to answer this question, I have to say that my research tried to connect the German history and especially the history of confessionalization, so the creation, the way the German state under the Reformation and the minority on their diverse territory with the history of the Mediterranean. And if we take the perspective of the Reformation, definitely the confessionalization is also a coercion, because it forced people to organize themselves and the community to control the numbers, the people who are, and sometimes didn't ask to be part of the group. From the example of Omer Aga, so this Ottoman merchant who tried to create an Ottoman community, a legal community in Vienna in the 1730s, definitely the Ottoman merchant didn't want that, because yes, of course, they had to pay more taxes and they didn't need an intermediary. So yes, at some point, being acknowledged as a community is also a way to be maybe put on the fringe of the society at some point. And it could have something, I mean, from the perspective of the outsider I am, it could be at some point very comfortable just to remain an outsider and being able to move, even if there is a lot of precarity, to move from one circle to the other and to not necessarily belong or to be prisoner of a single community.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Of course.
When it comes to the unincorporated people, is there not a risk in grouping? What about the diversities within the group? How does that affect the topic that we're just talking about?
Yes, it's actually depends on how the community is built. If it's a top-down relationship, so they decide to put all the people, and It happened with the Greek in Trieste. For example, the Habsburg administration decided that all the Orthodox should be together. At some point, the community split. It totally imploded because, I mean, being Greek, even being Orthodox, doesn't mean that you speak the same language and you refer to the same liturgy. And at the end of the 18th century, the community totally exploded. I don't have enough information about the museum to tell you more about how diverse was, at least from the religious perspective, this group. But in terms of the sociology of the group, of course, between a domestic servant, and there were many domestic servants from Muslim or Muslim origin in Vienna, and a wealthy merchant, they didn't have the same perspective and they didn't have the same interlocutor. So this power relationship was absolutely obvious. And even Osman Aga, so the guy who wrote the memoir in the early 18th century, he complained all the time that the Muslim came to him and asked him for help. He concretely said, I have a problem with these people because they put me in a very dangerous situation toward my protector, who were the Christian from the Viennese nobility, from the Habsburg nobility. So yes, definitely, it's not because the community is legally recognized that this community is homogeneous. On the contrary, it's really divided by tensions, social tensions, cultural tensions, economic tensions. And this is not the guarantee of the social peace. This is just a tool for the government, a tool for a ruler to govern the society.
Okay, thank you. We have one question from audience here, and we also have one question online, but please.
Hi, I'm Baxter. I'm one of the students, but I love looking at primary sources. It's just very interesting, regardless of the subject. What kind of process kind of went behind your research and looking for where do you start? How did you, what were you kind of searching for within these primary sources?
Oh, at the beginning, you mean? Okay, I didn't do the PhD I wanted because when you start just to research, you just go thread, and at some point it leads you in new territory. So I think what I wanted to do originally was a cross-cultural history, an history of the cross-cultural relation between Vienna and the Ottoman Empire. And my research ended up as a socio-economic history of this relation because I didn't have the documents I needed to write a cultural history. And progressively, so I studied initially the city of Vienna, and progressively when you follow just the trajectory of the people, they bring you to different cities. So this is an history of Germany, of the early Roman Empire. I didn't decide that. I just follow my sources because, again, I'm interested in the topic more than in the place and in the time. So this is also an history of Germany. This is also an history of Central Europe. This is also an history of Southeastern Europe, and hopefully also an history of the modest contribution to the history of the Ottoman Empire with the poor language I speak. So I think this is more the idea of the research also to follow my people, to follow the actor of the history I studied.
Thank you.
This is a dynamic tree.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Francesca Trivelato. I guess you know who is that. She said, I was wondering whether your most interesting research has given you new insight into the old Orientalist question. Why didn't Ottoman merchants elect consuls and organize themselves into merchant communities in the Habsburg Empire? If they were not prohibited from doing so, what advantages did they see in operating as individuals rather than as collective in the society of the time?
Well, I think I have partially answered this question with Sonia, but to answer Francesca, it's really depends from the city where you look at. So, for example, in Vienna, they really implement, I won't say the only thing they can do, but their political framework was the confessionalization. So from the perspective of Vienna, and in Vienna, they mostly try to organize community on the basis of the confession. In the late 18th century, they granted the Orthodox with the capacity, the Orthodox from the Ottoman Empire with the capacity to be a proper nation. And it was very important for the Habsburg administration to make a distinction between the Ottomans and the Habsburg subject, even when they were from the same religion. So they proceed like this. In Trieste, this is very different. In Trieste, in the middle of the 19th century, the Habsburg administration continued to mention a consul of Turkey, but nobody is appointed, and nobody has been appointed since Cristoforo Mamuca della Torre in 1760. Just because, I mean, there is the specific history of the Greeks that definitely impacted the history of Vienna, but I really think that from the perspective of the Muslim, it was much more interesting to multiply their cycle of social belonging, to extend their social surface, to trade in the city. They were not at the initiative of this consulate. The Greek merchants were in Trieste at the initiative of the consulate. And from the perspective of the Muslims, it was, I think, a benefit for them. And maybe they play also with what George Simmel calls the social secret. So they are not supposed to be there, but everybody knows they are there. So this gives them sort of freedom to operate in the city and to develop their connections.
So I guess being an urban historian really pays off for answering this question.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Christian, if I read first name well, Christian Atanasov, who is asking, who is a historian and archivist from Bulgaria. He says, "We're very interesting talk, thank you. Apparently, Muslims were not well incorporated in Christian cities in Central Europe during the Habsburgs. I also have two questions. Did the Muslims have any preferred professions? For example, certain crafts, activities related to trade, etc. And is there any information about their property status? Were they rich or poor?"
Again, it was very diverse population. So from depending of the archive you consult, you will have different kind of Muslims. And mostly the Muslims to which I pay attention were merchants from the Ottoman Empire. In their practice, there is no difference with the other merchants of the Ottoman Empire, the Greeks, the Jews, and the Armenians. So we can't really make any distinction between them. The merchants who operate in the Habsburg monarchy were almost all quite wealthy because it has for a lot of economic capital to start this kind of enterprise. But the Habsburg society has been also shaped by the captives. Even if there is this attempt of economic integration between the Habsburg and the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, there were also regular conflict between them. And all this conflict generates prisoners of war and captives. And the captives, this is again the history of Osman of Timișoara, but I have another example of a young lady in the late 18th century I can develop as well. They were just kidnapped, and in the expectation that someone in the family will pay the ransom. So it was an economic practice. I mean, from the Middle Age, even if the right of the people was an idea of the time, still it continued to be like this. And in the period of war, what we can see in the most important Habsburg cities is a huge part of the domesticity was made of Muslim people. Some of them convert, falsely or not. The other remain Muslims. After the war, or if someone pays a ransom, they return to the Ottoman Empire if they could, because it's also asks for a lot of very specific knowledge to make the trip and to go back to the Ottoman Empire, and other remain. And in the late, I mean, this is an extrapolation maybe, but in the late 18th century, the Ottoman ambassador arrived in Vienna, 1782, and he said, okay, there is this young lady you have, she's a captive. And her father is apparently an imam from Wallachia, and he would like his daughter to be back. And what we learn from the diplomatic paper is that she refused to return to the Ottoman Empire. And she said she had no intention to convert. She was just part of a very wealthy aristocratic household of that time, and she made her life in Vienna. And yes, she wanted to stay. It was really a problem because even the Ottoman, the Ottoman ambassador offered some money to her owner, to her master. Both agreed that an economic transaction would be possible, but she refused. So there is a huge diversity. It's really, I mean, this diversity really depends on the archival deposits we explore.
Thank you. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Zainab Abdi, and I'm also from Yemen. I'm studying my master in development practices at SIPA. So I really like when you mentioned about the mocha coffee or mocha. It's like region in our country. Not a lot of people know about it. I was wondering more within your research, did you talk to kind of like communities, people more in the memorial, like there's people who publish the book on the stories, but sometimes there's storytelling from generation to generation. And that takes me to, I don't know if you have been to Paço House, which is in Brooklyn, a Yemeni coffee place, where they talk about the origin of their coffee. It traced back to
Definitely in Williamsburg.
In Brooklyn.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really great. Like they talk about the history of like their founder and like
Absolutely.
from their like grandfather to all the way down to the owner of the restaurant right now. And like I'm kind of like wondering with your research and work, sometimes storytelling from the communities is very important that not get documented, but it being traced from a family to family.
And how I can use the oral history to understand the 18th century. I think it's possible. I'm not sure I'm able to do so. But there is definitely a history of the memory of the Ottomans in Central Europe. And this was even the starting point of my research when you just, I mean, in Vienna in the 15 years ago, the memory of the different communities in the city were competing to each other to revendicate the one who created the strudel, the one who imported the coffee in the city of Vienna. I think this is interesting as such. We don't necessarily have to determine who is true or wrong, but as such, this memorial dynamic for someone who has sensibility in anthropology is something very interesting because it tells a lot about the use of history and how the people try actually to find justification just to claim the right to be there, to see we have contributed to the development of one of the most wealthiest countries in Europe. So we have the right to be there and we want to be, to be recognized as contributor of your prosperity. I think this is interesting this way. But in terms of memory, it happened that a story has been written in 1783, meaning 1 century after the Second Siege of Vienna, about the origin of the coffee in Vienna. So in the context of the commemoration of the Battle of Vienna, the Habsburg, a monk, actually developed this idea that the coffee was a sort of trophy taken over the Ottoman. And the trophy meant two things. First, that the Habsburg monarchy was an Oriental power. Two, that it was the most powerful of the Oriental powers. This is a way to play with the memory, you see. This is certainly wrong. I mean, there is no way to know that, and we actually don't care. But the way they create the narrative, the way they use the memory, the way they articulate the present time with the history is, you are right, absolutely essential to understand the society. This is Levieux Mémoire, and this is even our everyday life when we have to cope with this policy of remembrance.
And you should go to the coffee place.
I've been there.
The
Absolutely, they have the big map with the, yeah. I know it.
That's cool.
Well, David, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is very, very enlightening and rich, and I like a lot of materials. Thank you all for coming here and for asking questions. I hope to see you in our next event, which will be announced in Harriman's newsletter for the November.
Thank you very much, Sacha. Thank you.